I call this meeting of the Water Planning Committee to order Tuesday, February 10th, 2015 at 6:29 p.m. Now we'll take the roll call.
Chairman Columbia.
Here.
Vice Chair Bannon.
Here.
Committee Member Menard.
Here.
Committee Member Hinman.
Here.
Committee Member Passion.
Here.
Committee Member Shine.
Here.
Committee Member Sharp.
Here.
Committee Member Wilson.
Here.
Committee Member Zednick.
Here.
Alternate Committee Crosby.
Here.
Alternate Zednick. Here.
Okay, looks like everybody's here. The first item on the agenda is to approve the draft minutes from the regular Water Planning Committee, which was held on January 13th, 2015. Can I have a motion and a second to approve the draft minutes?
Motion approved.
So I have a motion from committee member, let's see, you got to turn that now.
Passion.
There you go, Passion. And I need a second?
Second.
Second, and a second from committee member Hinman. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Motion carries. Okay, now it's time for citizens who would like to address the Water Planning Committee. Are there any speaker cards?
Yes. Nancy McMillan.
Nancy? Sorry. The Water Planning Committee will listen to comments and may take any one of the following: respond to criticism, request that staff investigate and report on the matter, request the matter to be scheduled on a future agenda. Each speaker is limited to 3 minutes. The yellow light and the buzzer will let you know that you have 30 seconds left to speak. Before you begin to speak, identify yourself clearly, stating for the record your name and address.
My name is Nancy McMillan, and I'm a resident of Australia Mountain Ranch. I'm not even sure I'm at the right meeting tonight, but we have had issues going on in our community for many, many years. I purchased my home in Australia in October of 2005. And with that, we got our governing documents and some disclosure papers and this and that. So I have my subdivision public report here for Australia Mountain Ranch and my parcel. And this is effective May 19th, 2005. And it basically says this development is within the service area of the city of Goodyear, which has been designated as having an assured water supply pursuant to ARS 45576 subsection B. The city of Goodyear's assured water supply designation is supported in part by the city's membership in the Central Arizona Groundwater Replacement District. Property within this development may be assessed a fee based on its prorated share of the city's cost for participation, which I think is fair. I found out about 2 years ago by our developer, Newland Communities, and we are a developer-controlled community, and we have been for well over 25 years. I have tried to get this pushed to the legislature. I've spoken with Senator Pancrazy about getting those kind of controls lifted, since most of the states in and around Arizona put a 7-year or 75% build-out, whichever comes first, and the control is then relinquished. But as I said, 2 years ago, reclaimed water became an issue in our community. And from what we have learned, the reclaimed water is an absolute have-to for the builder in order for the builders and the developers to continue moving forward within our community. It has been told to us that our HOA fees could go drastically, unbelievably high, because it could be about $800,000 a year to support the water needs in our community. Now, this is a complete contradiction of what I was told when I purchased my home within within my community. It says, it is anticipated that sometime in the future, the lakes within the park areas and open landscape areas may receive reclaimed water from the wastewater reclamation plant located within Australia Mountain Ranch. Also a part of my public report. It doesn't say that I have to pay through the nose for it. My question to you is, why am I going to be double dipped for water in my community? And why is our community the only one in the city that has reclaimed water? And I don't know if you can answer that or not. I've asked the city, and I'm still waiting for answers from them on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have no old business for this agenda, on this agenda for this meeting, so let's move on to new business. Moving on to new business, I'll turn this over to our facilitator, Teresa Mannikin.
All right, thank you. What we wanted to start out with tonight was to have Bob kind of clarify some of the information expectations and the timeline, because we got some, and during the discussion, during the last meeting, we thought maybe we need to clear some things up. So I'm going to let Bob start with that.
Thank you, Teresa. I'm pleased to be here tonight. I've been following the committee as you've been meeting and as you've been receiving a tremendous amount of information. And I thought it'd be just to take an opportunity to step back a minute to look at where we've been, what expectations that we have of you, and really open up an opportunity for you to ask any questions if you have any questions as far as the status of where we're at, some of the things that we'll be talking about in the future. So as I go through, I just have 3 slides before Dan Jackson gets into his presentation, but feel free to stop me, ask any questions as I go through the brief comments that I have. I'll start off with expectations. I want to be clear as far as what we expected from this committee is that we all recognize you bring different talents, different experiences to this committee, but you're not water experts per se. There's some that work in the business and some may have more information in their background than others, but this is really intended to be a representation of the community. So your thoughts, your questions are very vital to this entire effort. In the last few meetings that we've had, we've thrown a lot of information your way. We wanted to give you a base information as far as what we were dealing with, what our water system, what our wastewater system, what our recharge facilities look like. These are probably some of the things that you didn't realize were there, but before we could entertain the types of recommendations, we wanted to provide you some background in terms of what the status and current conditions are. In that process, we also wanted to give you that confidence that you knew enough about it to make informed decisions, not again as experts, but really representing the particular interests you have, the reasons that you chose to be on this committee, and also what your primary interest in this matter. But we hope over time you'll understand some of the circumstances that we're trying to address. We're not going to ask you to create your own rate recommendation. That's our job. We're trying to put the rate recommendations on the table for your discussion, for your comments, suggestions. If you have different ideas, or did you think about this, or was this considered? These are all points that we may, in our efforts to try to drive towards the recommendation, may not have considered. So this is going to be a valuable forum for us to understand, what did we miss? What other things should we be looking at that we haven't already been looking at or considered? We have consultants that we've hired. You'll hear Dan Jackson from economist.com. He is our rate consultant. He's very knowledgeable. He's a great experience in this the area of rate making, rate methodology, things that have worked in various communities. But he doesn't have all the answers, but he's going to provide guidance to us and hopefully to you also. The end goal, we talked a little bit about, where are we headed, what will be the deliverable in this effort. The end goal that we're looking for is that our staff and our council want to hear what you think, because we think that is going to be very representative of what we will expect our residents to hear and what their questions will be. So through your questions, through your comments. We hope to have those citizen eyes on it, customer eyes on this effort, and make the adjustments as we go through that we can to reflect that those concerns. At the end of this effort, we will provide a recommendation to you. That recommendation will be based on all the information that we've presented, and the reasons why. Try to explain the reasons why the elements of cost are in there. But that's not the end product. The end product that we will pass on to council will be a product with the recommendations from staff, but also recommendations and the comments, your observations through this process. You may not be in agreement with what the staff recommendations are. That's fine. That's what we want to hear. We don't want a rubber stamp. And I wanted to reiterate that because that's not the purpose of this committee. It wasn't the purpose of council to form this committee, and it isn't the purpose of staff. We may disagree on things, but we think it's a joint effort will be more productive to get as many issues out on the table for the council eventually to make an informed decision, both what the consultants, the experts, and what the citizen through you are saying about this recommendation. To be honest, we haven't extended this depth of a process to a committee through a rate process. We've had similar committees, but we've never gone into the amount of detail and background as we have during this effort. It was intentional. It was for the purpose of really drawing out not what we think is what is best for the community, but what the community thinks is best for the city now and in the future. Just a kind of a graphic to show where we've been. This kind of goes back to the last comment at the meeting that there was so much material that you were seeing, and the question came up about possibly subcommittees. Well, we think that subcommittees may be problematic only from this sense. It may drag out this entire effort, and it's hard working with a group of this size and pulling together subcommittees. So what we thought, if the need is to look at things more in depth, that we can schedule more meetings. We can go twice a month and really set up agendas that really focus in on what your questions or what your the information that you like to see that you may have not seen. So what the recap of where we're at today is the first bar there is the first introduction. It's really assembling the committee that we did in October. And that was for the purposes of just engaging all of you, giving a general description of what the course of this project would be and the committee expectations were. And then begin to talk about staff presentations about the various aspects of growth, our system characteristics, some of the challenges. And we had a brief review of utility finance fundamentals. In just recently, we're now into February and May period where we'll look at more of the fundamentals of the rate-making process. That's what tonight's meeting will be. In a meeting, the next meeting, we'll talk about the Integrated Water Master Plan consultant. They have finalized, not finalized, but they prepared a draft of a 5-year plan. We've received it. We're in the process of reviewing that document, and we're having a lot of departments weigh into the recommendations in that. So we're going to be coming together with the consultant with a consensus and recommendations to bring to you as far as what we think are the appropriate improvements to consider over the next 5 years. We'll also talk about in the next month or two the water resource policy, where our wet water will be coming from, where the paper water, what plans we have for the water rights aspects of it. And then the rate design alternatives will come before you to say these are the various options that we have to consider during in a rate process. And there'll be an opportunity for you to look, examine, hear that, and then have questions and comments. All through this process, what we heard last month's meeting was you need more time to talk. and we're going to intentionally build that in, and I think Teresa will explain that a little bit more, that's going to be valuable. Your opportunity for discussion is going to help clarify some of the issues and really understand the various concerns of all of you into more of a message that we can take back. And then finally, we have the next bar is in May and June, and that is where we'll actually look at the formation of the rates recommendations. That's the time when you will be asked to really provide more in depth in terms of recommendations, your comments, what we have included in it, if you're in agreement with it, if there are things that you think should be reviewed. That's the time when we're attempting to gather your comments. From that point on, we take it to the community. We have, I think there are 2 sessions, 1 or 2 sessions with the community where we'll invite the public in to hear their comments, have a brief presentation of what the recommendations are, and then seek additional comment from our residents and customers. Then it goes back to the council work session to actually let them study it. We'll give a presentation. They will then enact a period of time where they'll recommend for public notice of the proposed rate change. And then we'll have a 60-day period where they will provide, residents have an opportunity to provide comments back on what the proposed rate adjustments are. And then finally, after that information is all completed, the council in late September will be considering the final rate recommendation. So I hope that gives you a little more understanding of the schedule and what the steps are. We think there's still time, as we've laid this out, that will provide ample time for you to receive the information and ask any questions, and allow us time if there's something we need to check on and get back with the committee to respond. We can still provide that possibility. So tonight's meeting, the outcomes that we're expecting for tonight's meeting will be, first, you'll hear a presentation from Dan Jackson of the utility rates. He gave you an earlier presentation in December. But tonight, please ask any questions of Dan as he goes through his analysis to get clarity on any points that you have concerns or questions over. The rate structures will also include different user classes. There's various components as he'll go into what a rate study looks at, and the rate classes are one of those elements of a rate structure. We also want to hear the different alternatives that you'd like to see built into the rate models. If something like a conservation rebates are of interest, or incentives about such as front paying annual payments of water bills rather than regular bill payments. And just to let you know that Dan has also begun working on the rate design and the model. He's in the process of building it in once he gets the information from the Integrated Water Master Plan consultant. And we're going to be driving towards that position, or those results in the very near future, the next month's meeting. So with that, those are my comments. Do you have any questions of me that my comments might have precipitated, or you might have been thinking about? Well, thank you all for your attention and continued involvement in this. And with that, I'll turn it back to Teresa.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go over some quick meeting administration. We're going to have Dan Jackson come up in a moment, as Bob told you, to talk about the fundamentals of finance and rate making. What we'd like to do, because we found that in the previous meetings, it seems like sometimes if we try to ask the questions during the presentation, the answers may have been provided later on, or we might get sidetracked. So in the interest of time management, we're going to try it a different way tonight to see if it works better. And what we'd like to do is see if we can get all the way through the presentation And I would ask that if you have questions on a particular slide, if you write it down, and at the end, Dan would be more than happy to answer those. We just are hoping that'll help us manage our time better and still get to all the questions. And then Larry's up here as well, so he can help with any of the questions. Let's see. Oh, and then we're going to have dedicated time after that. So whenever Dan is finished, we're going to take a few moments and ask him any questions you have to clarify his presentation. And then if you have questions for the city, Larry's here. And then what we'll do is go into committee discussion where you can talk amongst yourselves or talk to us and the staff and give us items that you would like considered in Dan's work, because we're on the front end of it. So what you're going to hear tonight is not any kind of results or anything. You're on the front end of it. We want to hear what you would like considered. Does that all make sense? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Dan.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to come and talk to you all tonight again. The purpose of tonight's presentation is really to talk a little bit about fundamentals of rate making and utility finance. Now, I know that sounds about as interesting as an algebra class when you hear about it for the first time. And so I really want to emphasize a couple of things as we begin this presentation. And we're going to show some numbers, but the thing to concentrate on is not necessarily the numbers, because you see, rate making is as much a policy issue as it is a financial issue. One of the primary preconceptions or misconceptions many cities have is that rate consultants or rate people just kind of sit back in their office and they create this magical model, and that gives you the ultimate answer about what your rate should be. And that's not really the case, because you see, rate making is much more than just a financial or a technical topic. Rate making is as much a social, political, and community decision as it is a financial decision. Because one of the key aspects of rate making, rate designs, and setting rates for ratepayers is to answer the question of what is fair. What is just, reasonable, and fair? Well, guess what? The answer to what is fair is the answer that you decide what is fair. Different communities have different perceptions and different ideas about what is the most just, reasonable, and fair way to charge their customers for water service. There are some cities out there that believe that gross monthly minimum charges should be very high and volume rates should be very low. There are other cities out there that believe that minimum charges should be very low and volume charges should be very high. There are some cities out there that believe that some customer classes should subsidize other customer classes. Well, guess what? In a sense, they're all right, because what really matters is what the community decides is most just, reasonable, and fair. And so as we go through this presentation tonight, try to keep that in mind, that the policy decisions that you as a committee and that as Goodyear as a city ultimately decides on is going to be what drives your rate plan. Because after you've made the policy decisions, rate making is just basically arithmetic. You decide what you want to accomplish, and a rate plan helps you accomplish those goals. Then the question becomes how to ensure that it is done in a way that the greatest number of people in your community believe is the most just, reasonable, and fair. So let's start by going through some of the fundamentals and some of the background of a rate plan. What really is the purpose of a long-term financial and rate plan? Well, the purpose is several. First of all, most importantly, a rate plan is intended to generate sufficient revenue to enable you to pay for your operating expenses. You know, rate plans aren't going to do you any good if they don't generate enough money to help you meet your expenses. And remember, a water utility, wastewater utility is a business. It's like any other business. You need a certain amount of revenue to make ends meet. The rate plan will help you generate that revenue. What a rate plan will also do is help you fund the kind of capital repairs and improvements that are needed to ensure the continuing integrity of the system. Because while water utilities are very similar to businesses, there is one thing that is unique about them. Water utilities are part of your community. And the water utility that you inherit today, the water utility that you manage today, is the water utility that you are going to hand down to your children and grandchildren. And so for that reason, you have a special obligation to ensure that what you give them is in as good a condition as what you inherited. And that requires a certain amount of capital investment. Well, guess what? Capital investment comes at a cost. The more money you put into a system, the higher your rates have to be. However, the money can be considered an investment in the future of the city of Goodyear. Then finally, a rate plan to the best extent possible when you achieve those other goals. You also want to try to minimize the impact of any rate increases on ratepayers. Because I can promise you that any rate plan, any well-designed rate plan, not only for Goodyear, but for any other community in the state of Arizona, is going to require rate increases over the next 5 to 10 years. Rate increases are an unfortunate but inevitable fact of life because the cost of water service is going up. And so the question becomes, how do you manage these inevitable cost increases in a way that to the best extent possible minimizes that impact on the ratepayer? And that is a very important thing for us to consider going forward. Okay, as I go through this presentation, I'm going to be talking about a few terms. I'm going to be throwing out a few terms, and I thought that we would try to define a few of these terms before we really get into the meat of the presentation. One thing I'm going to talk about a lot is a term called cost of service. What is that? That's basically the total cost of operating the utility. We call it the cost of service. Another important term is something called a test year. How do you calculate the cost of service? You calculate it over a 12-month period. You have to find a reasonable 12-month period at which that you can estimate or calculate what your total costs are going to be. For the vast majority of cities, a test year is basically your budget year. And the great thing about a municipal utility is that you have a city council you have a city staff that develops a budget, and you have a city council that adopts a budget. So basically you have a statement from the city that this is what we think we have to spend to manage our operating, our water utility. That is the test year. Basically it's for the current year. Another term is something called billing units. That's basically the total volume of water that you sell, and it's the total amount of wastewater service that you sell. We call them billing units. Another key term is customer classes. Many people sometimes can be very surprised to hear this, but water doesn't cost the same to provide to all people. It costs you different amounts of money to provide water to different types of customers. And so what a typical utility does is it groups those customers into defined customer classes: residential, commercial, schools, industrial. In other words, classes or groups of people that have similar usage characteristics. That is a key component of rate making. And finally, another important term is something called peaking factors. And the reason why this is an important term is that the reason why it costs you different amounts of money to provide service to different customer classes is that different types of customers peak differently off your system. You have to build and maintain a water system that will provide service on the peak day of the year, because you don't ever want to have a situation where somebody goes into their kitchen, turns on the tap, and nothing comes out of it. So you have to make sure that on the absolute peak day of the year, you're able to provide water service. Well, what does that mean? That means 364 days out of the year, you got a system with excess capacity. And then the question you have to answer is, who is causing the peak? What customers are causing your system to peak? Typically, it's the residential customers. The reason is that in the summertime, residential customers use a lot of outdoor water usage. In the wintertime, they don't. So they have a very high peaking factor. Commercial customers tend to have much more steady usage because they use water for their businesses, and so they tend to use the same amount of water month after month after month. But peaking factors is a key component in calculating the difference in the cost of providing water to different customer classes. Okay. Some of the facts of life or realities of modern day rates. As I said earlier, costs are going up. That is a fact of life in the 21st century. Another important fact to keep in mind is that 30 to 40% of utilities across the United States right now have rates in place that don't cover their costs. What that means is that there are many cities out there that have decided that their general fund is going to subsidize their water fund. In other words, they're selling water at below cost. They're losing money on every drop of water that they sell. Now, they can do this if they want. They can subsidize from their general fund, but it's not really very good financial policy because you know what? Sooner or later, even governments run out of money. And you run out of subsidies. And then what happens? But the reason why this is an important fact is that many cities like to compare their rates to their neighbors. Well, if Goodyear's rates are higher than, I don't know, Avondale's or some other city, does that mean that our system is less efficient? No. It might mean that Avondale or other cities are selling the water at below cost. So keep that in mind, that many, many utilities haven't made the very difficult decision to raise rates and to ensure that what they charge for service covers all of their costs. Now, some utilities keep their costs low and they keep their rates low by not funding some of their critical needs. You know what? You can keep your rates low if you don't spend any money on your infrastructure. If you don't replace anything, if you don't repair any lines, that's great. You know, you keep rates low, and then all of a sudden one of your lines bursts, or your treatment plant fails, or your pump station fails. So that becomes a question that you have to look at from a policy standpoint. How much do we continue to invest in our system to ensure that it continues to operate properly? I have many clients that absolutely don't spend any money on capital improvements. And the analogy I like to use is it's very similar to, if you own a car, you can save $100 by not changing the oil in it. Well, that's great. Save $100. And then next year your engine blows out. So sometimes spending a little money saves you a lot of money in the long run. And then finally, I can tell you this as somebody who's done rate making for about 150 cities around the United States. Ratepayers tend to prefer gradual annual increases as opposed to one big increase. So many cities out there think they're doing their ratepayers a favor by holding rates down year after year after year and not doing an increase and not doing an increase. And then they find a situation where they've got to overhaul a treatment plant or do some other big capital expenditure. They've got to issue a $30 million bond, and so they have to do a 30% rate increase. Well, guess what happens? The ratepayers forget about the fact that they haven't had a rate increase in several years, and they got all upset about the fact that their bills have suddenly gotten higher. And then often what happens is you have a public hearing and people come and they say, why didn't you just raise our rates a little bit each year over the last 5 to 10 years? Then we wouldn't have had this big sudden shock to our bills. Well, that makes a lot of sense. So it is really something to keep in mind that if you implement or endorse a rate plan that has gradual increases each year, not only is that better on families, because it's a lot easier for families to gradually absorb it into their household budgets, but it also prevents rate shock. It also prevents that unfortunate surprise when you open up your water bill and find that the water bill is 30% greater than it was the month before. Nobody likes to see that. Okay, in a perfect world, you would have a situation where you would recommend a rate plan where rates would not only cover all their costs, but the rates for every customer class would cover the cost of serving that customer class. That's the ideal world. Well, guess what? We don't live in the ideal world. We live in the real world. And in the real world, there are sometimes instances where rates don't reflect costs, or maybe sometimes some customer classes subsidize others. I'll never forget early in my career, I did a study for a large city in Texas, and we discovered that the residential customer class was being subsidized heavily by the commercial customer class. So we came in with a great idea. We said, let's do a big rate increase on the residential customers, and let's lower the rates on the commercial customers. So we took it to the city council, and the city council looked at us and they said, are you out of your mind? I mean, residential ratepayers vote, commercial ratepayers don't. So who do we want? So yeah, there's a subsidy going on. That's okay with us. We don't mind. Now that's that city. That's not necessarily every city, but you have to take those factors into consideration. If you have a situation where one class is subsidizing another, it's hard to get rid of that overnight. You can't fix the problem overnight. Maybe you want to do it over the long run, but you don't necessarily want to do it right away. So the key challenge for policymakers such as yours is to find that balance, the balance between the needs of the ratepayers, the requirements that the utility needs for proper operation, and the desire to charge rates that reflect actual costs. these three factors here do not necessarily balance each other. Sometimes factor is considered to be more important than others. And that's one of the decisions that you all ultimately have to make. So, what this means, essentially, is that a long-term rate plan is ultimately a function of a series of operational and policy decisions. And here are what I consider to be the 5 critical policy decisions that you need to make. 1, what is the appropriate level of operating expenses? I mean, is it, there are different levels of operating expenses based on how you want to run a utility. Secondly, what environmental, geographical, and supply challenges does a utility face? We all know here in Goodyear, you've got major water supply challenges that you need to meet over the next several years. And one of the issues that you need to decide is how aggressively do you want to address those issues? Third, what are your goals regarding your level of service and system condition? There are utilities out there that feel like it is fundamentally critical that we provide the best quality of service possible. And if that means our rates have to go up every year in order to continue to supply a superior quality of service, well, that's fine. Because we live in a community where people don't mind paying a couple extra dollars a month each year to ensure that they've got a superior quality of service. There are other utilities where the rate increases are more important and maybe they feel like scaling back some of the quality of service. That's another important issue to look at. Another key factor is, do you want your utility to be standalone? Do you want the revenues from your rates to cover all of your costs? Or are you okay with maybe the general fund contributing a little bit to the water and sewer fund? That dreaded S word, subsidy word. It's not illegal to do a subsidy. It's not necessarily good financial policy. I would not personally recommend it, but it is something that many utilities out there do. And finally, what about the ratepayers? What is their economic background? How acceptable would rate design and rate adjustments be to the ratepayers? There are some cities we work with, particularly in the border area, where even a $2 a month increase is a real burden to some ratepayers. And so you have to look at what the willingness of ratepayers is and their ability to pay higher rates in the future. Okay. This is not quite. Huh? Whoops. Okay. This is not. Sorry, I'm a Mac guy, not a Windows guy. So there we go. Okay. How do you determine the cost of service? Well, you determine the cost of service through the use of a nationally recognized methodology. It's developed by the American Water Works Association. It's called the cash basis. It is used by utilities, by literally thousands of utilities throughout the United States. So the numbers that we show you are developed using a defined, nationally recognized methodology. It's not something we or the staff just sort of invented. It's something that follows a procedure. It's kind of like a financial statement. Balance sheets are the same for all different cities and for all different businesses, and they use a basic methodology in order to come up with each category of costs. And the same thing is true with water and wastewater rates. I'm sorry. Okay. Now, in this part of the presentation, I'm going to spend a little time going through how the cost of service was calculated. Once again, while numbers are important, it's really more important to look at this conceptually and look at it from a policy standpoint, because the numbers that we show you will reflect a lot of the operational and policy challenges that you as a committee and that Goodyear as a city face. These numbers are preliminary. They're based on the 2014 analysis, and I promise you they will be updated as the 2015 study is completed. But I think that basically they're a very good representation of where the city's water utility is right now. When we talk about cost of service, there are basically 4 components to developing what it costs to run a water and wastewater utility. The first component is known as operating expenses. The second is capital outlays. The third is debt principal and interest. And the fourth are transfers of funds. Now you'll note there's one thing there that's missing. Depreciation is missing. That's because under rate-making guidelines, you don't include depreciation. However, you include debt principal and capital outlays, and they basically offset each other. So if anybody has the question about why isn't depreciation in this, I just answered it. That's why it isn't. Let's talk about the first component, operating expenses. Well, operating expenses are basically the prudent and necessary costs that are required to operate and maintain the utility on an ongoing basis. What are operating expenses? Very simple. Things like salaries, permitting fees, advertising, vehicle repairs, chemicals, electricity, supplies, gasoline. In other words, these kind of operating expenses are fairly common to most businesses. Water and wastewater utilities are businesses, so they incur these kind of costs. It is not cooperating with me
What the
tonight.
heck?
There we go.
Firm direct approach.
Firm direct. Okay, I'll try that. Now, the city of Goodyear groups its operating costs into special accounting categories. On the water side, you've got 6 basic categories of operating costs. You've got the cap water costs, and then you've got administration, distribution, production, water quality, and water resources. Very simple. Now, on the wastewater, you've got administration, collection costs, environmental quality, and then the wastewater treatment plants. So this enables the city to characterize or categorize its operating costs into specific categories, and that helps you from an operating standpoint. Helps you understand what your costs are on an ongoing basis. Helps management manage the utilities more effectively. This right here is a forecast of the city's operating costs over the next 5 years. As you can see, to no great surprise, operating costs are expected to gradually increase over the next 5 years. The water utility had just over $9 million in operating costs in 2015. And as you can see, in 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019, they're expected to go up about $800,000 to $1 million a year. One of the main reasons they're going to go up is just due to inflation. Cost of everything goes up 3 to 4% a year. And so water utilities are no different, so their operating costs are expected to increase. Any well-designed or well-constructed rate plan has to take into consideration the fact that costs are going to be greater tomorrow than they are today. This rate plan takes that into consideration. On the wastewater side, same thing is true. As you can see, your operating costs gradually increase over the next 5 years. Now, the second category of costs are something called capital outlays. Capital outlays are known as small-ticket capital items. Things like vehicles, pumps, computers, that kind of thing. In other words, they're capital items that are paid for by ongoing revenues, and they're not paid for by issuing debt. No utility sells a bond to buy a truck. They buy the truck out of their ongoing rate revenues, but it is technically what's known as a capital expenditure. And so it is classified as capital outlays. Capital outlays also can be used to fund the very important repair and replacement reserves, because a well-run utility has to be able to put money aside each year for long-term repairs and replacements. Now, the city's capital rate plan contains 2 basic types of capital outlays. One are what's known as the standard capital outlays that are in the budget. And the second is something you'll probably be hearing a lot of in the coming months, and that is what's known as supplemental capital outlays. Those are additional expenditures that are recommended by staff. You see, you have a very big and very complex water and wastewater utility. It costs you millions and millions of dollars to build the thing. It costs you millions of dollars to operate it. And so, like any asset, it's going to wear out over time. And so money needs to be put into the system on an ongoing basis to continue to provide a superior quality of service. The question becomes, how much do we put in the system on an annual basis? And that, quite frankly, can be a decision that a lot of very well-meaning and learned people can disagree about. And it also depends on how high you want your rates to be. The more you put in for capital outlays, the higher your rates are going to have to be. And so what the city has done is the city has its standard capital outlays, and then it's got its supplementals that are capital outlays that are recommended by staff but not necessarily reflected in the total budget. So that is a topic that is under ongoing discussion in the city. How much should we fund in terms of capital outlays in the coming years? This right here is a reflection of your capital outlays. In the water utility, as you can see, your standard capital outlays are about $1.5 million a year. That's reflected in your budget. But the supplemental capital outlays are as much as another $2 to $2.5 million. So what that's telling us is there's a lot of additional need out there that we need to think about how we're going to finance, how much of it we want to spend, and how ultimately it's going to impact your rate plan. On the wastewater side, the standard capital outlays are just about $1 million a year. And then the supplementals are about the supplementals are kind of, they bounce around a little bit on the wastewater side. You see $2 million in 2015, $800,000 in 2019. And that's not unusual because, capital outlays can vary on a year-to-year basis, just kind of depending on what needs to be repaired or replaced at that time. But this is going to be a very interesting discussion, I think, that we're going to have in the coming months about these supplementals and how much capital outlays actually need to be financed in the coming years. Okay, let's go to the third one. We've talked about our operating expenses and we've talked about our capital outlays. The next is debt principal and interest. What that is basically it's the long-term debt that is issued by the water and wastewater utility to fund your capital improvement plan. There are large capital expenditures that you have, things like overhauling a treatment plant, building a water line, building pump stations and lift stations. Those are huge expenditures. And so the city of Goodyear, like most prudent utilities, has issued debt, long-term debt, in order to pay for these big capital improvements. Now, the rate plan that is ultimately decided upon by the city is going to be composed of two types of long-term debt. The first is your current debt, the debt that's already out there, debt that you've already issued and that you're already paying on. Those numbers are pretty definitive. I mean, your debt is what it is, and that's part of your budget, and that has to be funded. The second part, though, is the part that's a little bit more, nebulous. That's the future debt. That's the long-term debt that's forecast to be issued to fund the future capital improvements. And this is where your discussion on the master plan is going to get really interesting, because you're going to have your engineers talk about your master plan, how much needs to be spent on the master plan in order to fund all of the things that have been identified. Well, you fund that through issuing long-term debt, and that's how it ripples through to the rate plan. And so capital improvement plans impact rates in two ways. One, how much do you have to spend? And two, when do you have to spend it? And so if you decide that you're going to, that is important enough to fund all these capital expenditures and all these master plan expenditures right up front, right in the next couple of years, if you have to spend $70, $80 million on capital improvements in the next couple of years, that's going to mean larger rate increases because you got to issue a lot of debt. And if you're going to want to issue debt, you've got to set rates at a level that will enable you to recover, the debt service. Because if you don't put rates in place that cover your debt service, then you're not going to be able to issue the debt. Now, an alternative plan is maybe issue the debt over longer periods of time. If you don't issue all $70, $80 million up front and you issue it just a little bit at a time, then that might give you the ability to phase in a rate plan over a little bit longer period of time. It's a bit of a balancing act between what needs to be done and how much you're willing to spend. So it's always an interesting argument between the engineers and we financial people. The engineers get up and say, we got to do this, and we got to do that, and we got to repair this, and we got to replace that. And we financial guys get up and say, well, that's all well and good, but how are we going to pay for all this? So that's the balancing act that a utility has to go through. What needs to be done versus how much you're willing to spend. This is your current debt service. The City of Goodyear's water and wastewater utility has about $11 billion in debt service each year. And as you can see, that's expected to be pretty steady over the next 5 years. One of the bond issues drops off in the next 4 years. And in my professional opinion, this is about what you'd expect a utility this size to have. you have a lot of needs. You've had to do a lot of capital repairs, and so for a utility your size, $11 million in annual debt service, that's right about par for the course. And as you can see, it's split pretty evenly between the water and wastewater utility. Now, when we did the 2014 rate plan, we made some broad assumptions about what the long-term capital needs were going to be because the master plan hadn't been done yet. So we had to make some preliminary estimates. We spent a lot of time talking with city staff about what kind of numbers they thought the capital improvements would come in at. And so we made these assumptions, and that's what has gone into the long-term plan. What we assumed was that you'd issue about $11 million in debt in 2015 and about another $51 million of debt in 2019. What's the terms of the debt? Debt would be about 30 years in duration. Interest rate about 5.5% with a one-year reserve. That's a fairly standard set of terms. The interest rate might be a little high because I've been hearing that WIFA and some of these other agencies are actually issuing debt a little bit less than that. Isn't that right? WIFA's coming in a little less than that now, isn't it?
Well, with our AA rating, we would issue it at less than that today's environment, but you're talking over the next 5 years.
Mm-hmm. So you never really know. I mean, interest rates are about as low as they're ever going to go right now. But it is something to keep in mind that when you do undertake this master plan, you've got to issue debt, and the debt's going to have to be paid back, and it has to be reflected in the long-term rate plan. For the purposes of our study, we assumed about $62 million in debt. The majority of it would be water-related. As you can see, this is our initial estimates for future debt service. As you can see, nothing right now, but eventually water would have as much as $4 million in new debt by 2019, and wastewater, not very much, only about $500,000 in debt. Now, if any numbers are going to change when we come to 2015, it's going to be these numbers, because I'm as anxious as the rest of you to see what the master plan is going to come in at in terms of what the capital improvement needs are going to be. And that is going to have a heavy impact on your long-term rate plan. Okay, we've talked about operating expenses, capital outlays, and debt principal and interest. There's one more category of costs. This category of costs is known as funds transfers. The purpose of this is as follows. You see, you've got a water and wastewater fund out there. It's a division of the city of Goodyear. There are other parts of the city of Goodyear that support the water and sewer fund. Administration, accounting, finance, billing and collection, police and fire, city council. All of these different city departments provide support to the water and wastewater fund. So the properly managed water and wastewater utility does what's called a funds transfer to the general fund to reimburse them for the efforts that they make in supporting the water and wastewater utility. Now, not every city does this. Many cities don't, as a matter of fact. But it is very prudent financial planning to do that. Because, you see, if a water utility does not reimburse the general fund for these different services, then basically the general fund, it's kind of like a hidden subsidy. So if the water utility fund does reimburse the general fund, then the general fund has more revenue on which it can use to provide other vital city services. Now, the general rule of thumb is for funds transfers is that they're about 5 to 10% of revenues. You take about anywhere between 5 to 10% of your total revenues and you reimburse it to the general fund, and that's the general fund transfer. So what does City Goodyear do? Well, its water utility funds transfer is just over $1 million a year, which is about 5 to 6%, and its wastewater funds transfer is about $700,000 to $800,000 a year, which again is about 5 to 6%. This is very good financial policy. It takes discipline, financial discipline to do this, and I applaud the city for the fact that they have instituted this, because I'm here to tell you, a lot of cities don't do this. Okay, so we've gone through all those elements of cost of service. What does it cost you to run your water and wastewater utility? Well, in 2015, it cost you about $20 million to run your water utility. and it costs you about $14 million to run your wastewater utility. And as you can see, the water utility is expected to go from $20 million to $27 million by 2019. That's a pretty big increase from 20 million to 27. What's driving that? Well, it's this line item right here, future debt. Of the $7 million increase in water costs over the next 5 years, $4 million of it is expected to come from funding your long-term capital plan. That's exactly what you'd expect a city like Goodyear to see. So that's why I keep saying that the capital plan is going to be the principal driver of what your ultimate rate plan is going to be. How much you want to fund, how you want to fund it, how aggressively you want to repair and maintain your water system is going to have a direct impact ultimately on what your rates are going to be. On the wastewater side, the impact isn't anywhere near as dramatic. You've got total costs of about $14 million in 2015, going up to about $15 million in 2019. So the wastewater utility, the long-term capital plan, doesn't impact it nearly as much. Okay, now we know what our costs are. Let's turn our attention to the revenue side. We know what our costs are. How are we going to get the money to pay all these costs? Well, there are two ways a water and wastewater utility gets its revenues. One is through rates. One is through charging for water service and wastewater service. The other is through something called non-rate revenues. Non-rate revenues are known as one-time charges for specific services provided to individual ratepayers. These are services like connection fees, meter tests. Customer wants their meter tested, a disconnect notice, special meter read. A ratepayer says, there's no way I used 24,000 gallons of water last month. Would you come out and read my meter again? Well, in other words, they are specific services for specific individuals. And the city of Goodyear, like most well-run water and wastewater utilities, charges customers when they do these specific services. The charge is generally based on the cost the utility incurs in providing that service. It costs you a certain amount of money to send somebody out to build a connection. It costs you a certain amount of money to send out and do a special meter read. And so you get a certain amount of revenues from your non-rate services, and that is subtracted against your cost of service to come up with the revenue requirement to be raised from rates. So you start out with your cost of service, you subtract your non-rate revenues, and what's left is the revenue requirement that you got to raise from your rates. As you can see, on the water side, your non-rate revenues are a little over $2 million a year, about $2.3 to $2.4 million a year. So if you have a $20 million cost of service, and $2.3 million of that is non-rate revenues, that means you've got to design rates that are going to come up with about $17.9 million in revenue. That's your break-even point. And as you can see, your cost of service is going to continue to go up. Non-rate revenues are an important source of funding for any water and wastewater utility. On the wastewater side, your cost of service of $14.3 million, your non-rate revenues are $563,000, which means your rates have to recover about $13.8 million. So now we know how much our rates have to recover. So I'm going to skip over this page, and I'm going to go directly to customer classes, because that is another very important topic. We know how much revenue we need to get now from our ratepayers. Now we got to figure out who we're going to get it from. What particular customer classes are we going to get it from? Now, you see, and I want to go back to what I said at the beginning of the presentation. This is a very important point. Utilities incur different costs for customers based on each customer's service characteristics. See, when you think about it, every single customer in the city of Goodyear has a unique cost of service. Because you look at a residential home. Well, how many people are in that home? 4, 5, 6? How much water do they use? Do they have 2 teenage daughters like me who take 30-minute showers? Or are they a retired couple who only uses a couple thousand gallons a month? Is it composed of a family that loves to water their lawn 5 times a week, like my wife? Boy, am I glad she's not here.
You have a lawn?
This is recorded, I believe.
Uh-oh. Or are they people that don't hardly water their lawn at all? You see, in theory, every single customer imposes a unique cost on the utility. But in reality, no utility is going to calculate a unique rate for every customer. It's really impossible to do. So what a utility does is it groups customers with similar characteristics into classes. Your residential customers, your commercial customers. Now, every once in a while, you're going to get customers that are going to argue that it's just not fair. You know, I live, a customer that lives, for example, across the city from the treatment plant, from the wastewater treatment plant, is going to have a much higher cost to the city of servicing than the guy who lives across the street from the wastewater treatment plant. The reason is that the guy who lives right across the street from the wastewater treatment plant doesn't really use any of the collection system. But the guy who lives across town uses the entire collection system. Same thing is true with the water system. The further you are away from the water source, the more it costs the city to provide service to. But once again, you're not going to calculate a unique rate for every customer. You're going to group them together. And does that mean that some customers are paying a little more in their costs and some are paying a little less in their costs? Well, yeah, it does. But you know what? The world isn't perfect and life isn't always fair. You have to do, the best that a utility can be expected to do is group customers into similar characteristics. Similar doesn't mean exact. Similar means similar. And so every once in a while, you're going to get that customer who argues, I shouldn't have to pay the same rate as everybody else because I have this special circumstance. Well, you know what? You may have a special circumstance in one area, but you may have a higher cost in other areas. So bottom line is, all residential customers in the city of Goodyear pay the same residential rate. Now, these are your customer classes. The city of Goodyear, in my opinion at least, has a very, very effective set of customer classes. You've got residential city customers inside the city. You've got residential county, in other words, customers that are outside your city limits. You group your multifamily customers into a unique class, which is a very good. Not all cities do that. Your commercial customers, basically your businesses, small, medium-sized businesses. You have an interesting class. You have churches in a separate class. Not all cities, characterize churches separately, but Goodyear does. You've got industrial customers, hydrants, institutional customers, schools, and irrigation. So you've got a total of about 15,000 water customers, and you've got basically the same types of customers on the wastewater side. You have a lot of different customer classes that you have identified for the city of Goodyear. What that does is that gives you the ability, if you so choose, to charge a separate rate for each of these customer classes, if that's what you ultimately want to do. Now, remember at the beginning of the presentation I talked about something called peaking factors? The basic rule of thumb in rate making is that the higher the peaking factor, the more it costs you to provide that service. This is your peaking factors across all of your customer classes. Your smallest peaking factor are your multifamily customers. And think about that. That makes perfect sense when you think about it. Multifamily customers are all in an apartment. By definition, somebody who lives in an apartment doesn't have a yard. So they're not going to be watering their lawn. So all they're going to use this month, next month, and every month is the water that they use inside their house. So they're going to have very, very steady usage, and they're going to have a very low peaking factor. Your industrial customers are also very low. Now, the city of Goodyear has something that is a little unusual here. Your residential and your commercial peaking factors are right about the same. Typically, for many cities, the residential one is higher than the commercial one, but yours are actually about the same. Thought that was interesting, at least. And then some of your other customers are higher. Your schools, for example, have one of the highest peaking factors. Think about it. Football fields, stuff like that they got to water. And the fact that they're closed in the summertime and they're open other parts of the year, so they're going to have much higher water usage some parts of the year than they are at others. Irrigation is the highest class except for hydrants. Hydrants is kind of a unique category because a hydrant can have zero usage for 9 months and then have 1 million gallons in the 10th month. But irrigation is typically the highest because you think about it. In the summertime, people are irrigating. In the wintertime, they're not. So If you were to set rates for different customer classes, generally, these would be the lowest rates, and these would be the highest rates. This chart right here just shows what your average monthly consumption is per account. Guys like me love charts like this. As you can see, your average residential customer uses about 8,000 gallons of water a month. Now, average is an average. It means some people use more, others use less. But 8,000 gallons is right about what the average is, and it's about what you'd expect for a city like Goodyear. And then, you know, some of your customers, like your multifamily and industrial, are very, very high usage per meter. Irrigation is extremely high. And then, as you can see, schools and institutional are high also. And then some of your others are very, very low. Okay. When you do a long-term financial plan, it's going to be based on a series of assumptions. A financial plan is not only expected to meet your needs for today, but it's also expected to meet your needs for tomorrow and the years after that. Well, none of us can tell the future with perfect accuracy. All we can do is make a series of assumptions about what we think is going to happen in the future. We have already shown you what we think your costs are going to look like. Now let's look and see what your customers are going to look like. Our projection right now is that you're going to grow by about 500 to 600 customers a year. You have about 15,445 accounts right now, and as you can see, it's expected to grow by 500 to 600 accounts per year. It could be more than that, it could be less, but this is fairly consistent with what you've seen over the last couple of years. What does that mean? Well, if you have more accounts, you're going to have 5,000 more accounts in 2023 than you have today. And the more accounts you have, the better it is from a rate-making standpoint, because the more customers you have, the more you can spread your costs over and the less you have to charge everybody. This is your historical and forecast water consumption. Because when you set rates, you set it not only by customer, you also set it by the amount of water that you plan on selling. Your water usage has actually been fairly flat over the last 4 years, but we're anticipating at least that you're going to start to see a little bit of an increase in your usage over the next 10 years, and that's just due to the fact that your growth is going to continue to increase. You've done very well as a community in conserving water usage over the last several years. You've seen a decline in the usage per meter. I think that's a good thing, but I think that from a rate-making standpoint, it's generally good to not get too aggressive in assuming how much people are going to conserve water usage. So basically, we're assuming that people's usage of about 8,000 gallons a month is going to continue. Maybe it'll keep going down. I don't know. Don't know for sure, but I think right now, for the purposes of this forecast, 8,000 gallons a month continues to be a good number to use. Okay, now we're into the rate design part. Now we're into the part where we get to make some policy decisions. This is the fun part. See, our water rates are assessed in two components. You've got a base charge, which is a monthly charge for the availability of service, and then there's a volume charge, a charge per 1,000 gallons of service. Let's talk real briefly about why it's reasonable to charge a base charge and a volume charge. Every once in a while at a public hearing, I'll get a customer that says, it's not fair that I have to pay $10 a month. If I don't use any water that month, why should I have to pay anything? Well, let me tell you why. Because you have to have a water system in place that will provide service to you whether you want it or not. That water, the 24/7, that water system has to have the availability that any time of the day or night that you turn that tap, water is going to come out of it. That comes at a cost. There are many fixed costs in a water system, and many costs that you will incur whether you sell 1 gallon of water or 1 billion gallons of water. That's why it's reasonable to have a monthly availability charge, because the cost of providing water is not just the water itself, it's the availability of that water. That is a key point that people need to understand when they look at long-term rate planning. Now, your volume charge is based on what's called an inverted block. In other words, the more ratepayers use, the more they pay. It is a conservation-based rate structure. It is intended to provide a financial disincentive to customers to use excessive amounts of water. At the same time, the lowest amount of water that you use, or what we call the non-discretionary amount of water that you use, you pay the lowest rate for. That's good because the water you use inside your house for drinking and bathing, washing dishes, all of that you pay the lowest rate for. It's only when you start to get into discretionary water usage, like lawn watering and car washing, filling a swimming pool, that kind of thing, those are the levels that you start paying the higher rates for. And so generally, your low income and your fixed income people generally, but not always, but typically have the lowest levels of usage. So a conservation-based rate is beneficial in a number of ways. Not only does it encourage conservation and encourage people to conserve this precious and diminishing natural resource, but it also, to the best extent possible, helps people who have the least ability to pay their water bills. This is your current rate structure. And you should have called that prior rate structure because this is the rate structure that's currently in place. If you have a 3/4 inch meter, and that's a typical meter for a residential customer, right now you pay $11.24 a month. That went up from $10.23 last year. If you've got a larger meter, you pay a larger availability charge. Makes perfect sense because it costs more to have service availability for a 2-inch meter than it does for a 3/4 inch meter. So you pay $40 a month if you have a 2-inch meter. Thing is, there aren't that many people out there that have 2-inch meters. Virtually no residential customers, mostly just commercial customers. This is your block rate. If you use between 0 and 6,000 gallons, you pay $1.30 per 1,000 gallons. If you use between 6 and 12,000 gallons, the rate goes up to $2.59. If you use between 12 and 30,000 gallons, it goes up to $3.89. And then if you use above 30,000 gallons, it goes to $6.25. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. The average amount is 8,000 gallons a month. So what that means is about 60 to 70% of water bills on a yearly basis will be 8,000 gallons or less. So the majority of water bills are going to be in this lowest block. There aren't that many customers, particularly residential customers, that use more than 30,000 gallons, but there are some. And so they pay a lot more. The water's there for them to use. But if you're a residential customer and you're using more than 30,000 gallons a month, that's a lot of water for a residential customer to use. And so they pay the largest rate. Okay, you have an interesting non-residential rate. Right now, you have lumped basically all of your commercial, churches, and other schools and other classes into a non-residential rate. It's also a block rate. As you can see, if you're a non-residential customer and you use between 0 and 40,000 gallons, you pay $3.30. If you use between 40 and 100,000 gallons, you pay $5.28. And if you use over 100,000 gallons, you pay $6.86. Now, why do I say that this is unique? I wouldn't call it unique, but I would say this. Many cities have chosen to have a flat rate for their commercial customers. The reason is that commercial customers generally have less discretion in their water usage than residential customers do. Because a business, typically the water that they use is water that they use for business purposes. And so sometimes businesses, particularly large businesses, will argue that they're being unjustly penalized by paying this high rate because they need to use several 100,000 gallons a month. Let's take an example. Let's say Campbell's Soup came in and decided to build a factory here in Goodyear. Well, guess what? They'd use an awful lot of water each month. And should they have to pay a high rate? Well, there's not really a way that they can conserve very much unless they make less soup. But so many cities charge a flat rate. That's one of the policy decisions that you all should think about. Should you have a flat rate? Also, should you have a different rate for a church or a school? Many cities have different rates for schools. And they have higher rates for schools. The school board doesn't like it very much, believe me. But schools, and you saw the evidence here in Goodyear, schools have a higher cost of providing service. So shouldn't they have to pay more? Once again, another thing to think about. Okay, let's talk about your wastewater rates. Wastewater rates are also in two components. Base charge, monthly charge for service availability. Well, if you want that water tap to go, you certainly want that toilet to flush. So you've got to have the availability of service. So you have a base charge, and then you've got a volume charge per 1,000 gallons. Now, we touched on this a little bit in December, but I want to talk about this again because this is an important thing for you all to think about. Your volume charge right now is based on something called a winter average. It is the most common form of wastewater rate design. The reason why you have a winter average is that you have to estimate the amount of wastewater that a residential family and a commercial business contributes to the system. You see, in water service, you've got a meter. All your water goes through a meter, goes into your home. So you know exactly how much water a home uses. Wastewater, you don't. There is no such thing as a residential wastewater meter. So how much wastewater are you putting into your system? Well, you know that not necessarily all of your water is going back into the wastewater system, particularly if you have a yard that you're watering. So you've got to make some kind of estimate about how much wastewater you're actually contributing to the system. Now, different cities have different ways that they do this, but the most common one, as I said, is known as the winter average. I'm first going to show you the rate, and then I'm going to show you how the winter average is calculated. On the wastewater side, you've got a base charge of $21.12 a month, and it's based on your water meter. And once again, that goes up with the larger water meter. But you have a flat rate of $5.78 for all of your wastewater customers. That's because your wastewater is considered to be what is known as domestic strength sewage. In other words, the sewage has about the strength of a domestic or residential household. Now, how do you calculate a winter average? Well, here in the city of Goodyear, you use 3 months. You use January, February, and March. This chart right here is the average usage per meter for your residential customers for the calendar year 2013. As you can see, in January, February, and March, you generally had the lowest usage because they're winter months. And so the amount of outdoor water usage is going to be minimal. But once you get up into the summer months, as you can see, the average usage goes way up. So what a winter average does is it caps your wastewater usage. Your winter average right here is about 6,000 gallons. So what it means is in December, in January, you use 6,000 gallons of water and 6,000 gallons of wastewater. So you pay 6,000 gallons for water, and you pay for 6,000 gallons of wastewater. In August, you're using 12,000 gallons of water. So you pay for 12,000 gallons of water, but you only pay for 6,000 gallons of wastewater because you're capped out. Because it is assumed that all the water usage above 6,000 gallons goes outdoors. Now, winter averages are not perfect. The main reason winter averages are not perfect is because here in Arizona, we have a very temperate climate. And so it is not beyond the realm of possibility that customers will use water outdoors in the winter months. Now, winter averages are golden in places like Green Bay, Wisconsin, where it's inconceivable that somebody is going to water a lawn in December. The only time that's ever happened is when Vince Lombardi watered his football field the day before the Ice Bowl against the Cowboys.
But don't be bitter.
It's only 50 years. I haven't gotten over it yet. He watered the lawn. He watered the field, and the field froze, and that gave the Packers an advantage over that game. It was so unfair. But I digress. Sorry. But anyway, but again, I mean, obviously in the northern climates, winter averages are much more perfect. This is not a perfect system, but there is no such thing as a perfect system. There are alternate ways of charging for wastewater service. Some cities just charge for 100% of water usage. If you use the water, you pay wastewater on it, but they get a lot of complaints about that because there are going to be people that say, I water my lawn, why should I pay sewage on that? And I think that's a reasonable point. Oops. Okay, the rate, as you all know, the city did a modest rate adjustment in late 2014. They raised the water rate by 5%, and they kept the wastewater rate where it is. What was the impact of that? Well, this chart right here shows that a 5,000-gallon water and sewer user paid $66.15 in 2014 and now pays $67.76 for that same service, an increase of about $1.61. A 7,000-gallon user paid about $1.96 more, and a 15,000-gallon user paid about $4 more. So the rate adjustment was very, very modest last year. The vast majority of ratepayers saw their bills only go up $1 to $2 a month. Now, some people saw it go up more. Your non-residential, commercial customers who typically use more water, they, of course, saw their bills go up a little bit more. But from a percentage standpoint, it was more in the 2 to 3% range. Why is that? Because there's a 5% water and 0 on wastewater. So what people generally care about is what's my total bill. And so the combination of the two meant that most people's bills went up 2.5 to 3%. Okay, as we move into the future, you do have the ability to consider alternative rate structures if you want. You've got what, in my opinion, is a very solid rate structure in place right now. However, you also have the ability to decide that, maybe there's a rate structure out there that's more just and reasonable and fair. And how do other cities do it? Well, there are several alternative water rate structures that other cities have in place. One is just a plain uniform rate. Get rid of the inverted block and just charge a flat rate for water usage. What would the impact of that be? Well, it would probably increase your usage, but it would also be what would generally be known as a regressive increase, because if you went from an inverted block rate to a flat rate, you'd see an increase on your low-volume users and a decrease on your high-volume users. So your high-volume users will be real happy, but your low-volume users aren't going to be very happy. But that is one of the impacts. Some cities use what's called seasonal rates, where in May through August, they charge one rate, and in September through April, they charge a different rate. Those are going out of favor. I personally, I'll just interject my own personal opinion here, I don't love those rates because I think they're very confusing. Let's see now, is it May when it goes into effect, or is it June? And if it's June, but it went into effect in May, does the usage on my June bill, is that my May usage, so do I pay more? It can be very confusing. And like I said, in the industry, block rates have sort of taken the place of seasonal rates. There's also another rate structure called a declining block, where actually the more you use, the less you pay. Well, those rate structures used to be very common because, to tell you the truth, that follows water utility economics. Because water utility economics is based on something called economies of scale. The more you use, the less it costs. And so a declining block kind of follows that. The problem is that doesn't encourage conservation. Wastewater rate structures, as I said, one is a fixed monthly charge. Another is maybe you use 75% of water usage, or maybe you use 50% of water usage. But the important thing to keep in mind, if you want to think about changing your rate structure, is that when you change a rate structure, you run the risk of creating what I like to call winners and losers. What will happen is, if you go from an inverted block to a flat rate, some people are going to see their bills go down. Some people are going to see their bills not change at all. Some people are going to see their bills go way up. So who do you think you're going to hear from? So that's the problem with doing those block rates. So, to my last chart. I know that there's been a lot of information in this presentation, but once again, the idea behind this presentation is to give you an idea of how policy decisions impact long-term rate plans. Rate making is arithmetic. It is the mathematical adoption of policy decisions that you as a committee make. And so as we move forward, we would like to hear what you think is just and reasonable and fair. The decisions that you ultimately make will be reflected in the final rate plan. But I think that hopefully you've got some pretty good idea of not only about what's going on in the world, but about how some of the decisions you make will impact water and wastewater rates. For example, the decisions you make regarding the supply challenges. Most importantly, how aggressively do you want to fund cap water and some of these other upcoming liabilities. The more aggressively you fund it, higher the rates are going to have to be. Secondly, how important is it to continue to provide an absolute superior quality of service? You have a great quality of service here. If you believe that it is critical that we not take any risks of any system outages or problems or line breaks or anything like that, well, that's going to require investment, and investment is going to require higher rates. Should the utility continue to be standalone? Yes, it should. But that is an important thing that you should think about. Another thing is the economic background of the ratepayers. How sensitive do you believe ratepayers will be to rate adjustments? Because ultimately they're going to be the ones paying the bills. And finally, the master plan. One of the things, when I look at a master plan, the only thing I think about is how are we going to pay for it? Because I'm a finance guy. Obviously, that's not the only factor in a master plan, but it is a factor that needs to be taken into consideration. And the more aggressively you fund a master plan and the more quickly you fund some of these improvements, the more and higher your rates are going to have to be. Anyway, thank you very much for letting me drone on for as long as I have. I'd be happy to answer any questions you've got this time.
I think maybe, thank you, Dan. If I could start right before the question, just a couple of items that I wanted to bring out from Dan's presentation. I am Larry Lang, by the way. I've been told I didn't introduce myself. I'm the finance director for the city of Goodyear. So when Dan talks about how are you going to pay for it, needless to say, that is something near and dear to me. On that list where Dan lists out policy considerations and so forth, our city council, because of our circumstances in Goodyear, where everything or virtually everything north of I-10 is outside of our service area, believes it's very important that these utilities are self-sustaining so that the property taxpayers north of I-10 are not subsidizing it. So for them, that is really, I don't even want to be in the room when that conversation took place. They're pretty firm on that particular one for that very reason. There's a lot of people that don't pay into our system. The other comment that I was going to add in there is what Dan kind of said, that we need the input on the rate structure, and I know there's a couple of ideas that need to be talked about tonight, and we want that. I definitely think there's some opportunities for change in it. I'm hoping, as the person who has the customer service reps, the ones that actually take the phone calls when we have these changes, as the person that has them in my department, I'm hoping that they're not substantive so that you get a huge impact from a lot of customers calling, but that instead we're dealing with the true equity situations, and I think there's a few out there. So I thought I'd just kind of throw that as my own little personal plug, that I wouldn't want to start with a blank slate and let's try to regenerate completely how we do it, but I think we need to talk on some equity things. And with that, Dan is here to take questions. I'm here to take questions. And then I think, as Teresa said, you're going to facilitate kind of the group discussion after we've taken those questions.
Chairman?
Bill?
Go ahead.
All right.
I have a list of them.
Oh, I've got one. Chairman? Dan, one of the questions I had was, it goes back to the water rate plans and the structure that we have. I think it's on slide 38, I'm sorry. One thing I noticed is like in the residential, you've got 0 to 6, 6 to 12, and then we have like a 12 to 30, a big jump. Mm-hmm. Is that unusual, or is that, do a lot of the cities do that breakdown? I know some of the other cities, like the one I work in, and when I was in private industry, we broke those blocks much closer for the conservation. Mm-hmm. And it's a big jump here, and I didn't know, is that unusual, or is that pretty typical for Arizona cities?
I wouldn't necessarily call it unusual. It is, the 12 to 30 block is a little higher than you'd expect. The general rule of thumb is that the first block goes up to just about the average, the monthly average. The second goes up to about twice the monthly average. And then after that, many utilities only have three blocks. Some have 4 and 5, some have 8 or 9. So there's a lot of discretion involved in it. While I would say that this jump here is a little higher than what I typically see, I wouldn't call it overly unusual.
Okay. Would that be the same for like our non-residential, like 0 to 40, and then from 40 up to 100? Or is there usually more rate blocks broken into that area for non-residential?
Well, one of the issues with commercial is there tends to be a lot more variation in commercial usage than there is in residential usage. A lot of residential homes have fairly consistent usage patterns, whereas a business, a flower shop and a Walmart are both commercial customers, but they have radically different water usages. So it's much more difficult to come up with block levels for commercial customers than it is for residential. If you look at this chart back here, and this is a good example. Your average commercial customer uses 58,000 gallons a month. But as you can see, churches are down at 34, multifamilies are up at 90, industrials are up at 150. So most of them, as you can see, most businesses are institutional, schools, and commercial, and they're at the 50 to 60 range. So that makes 40 a little bit more palatable.
Okay.
Because it's a little less than the average. Just like in the residential, the first block is a little less than the average. I think, I didn't develop the blocks were here when we got here, but that seems to me to be the logic behind the blocks.
Okay. No, that answered it. Thank you.
Committee Member Zenit, go ahead.
I have a few of them here, and I'll just go through a couple of them, let somebody else speak, and then I'll come back and hit you with some later.
You got,
okay?
Bill? I got 9. How
You
many
got
you
9?
What do you got?
I probably got about 30 here. So
30?
yeah.
Oh, awesome.
So between you and I, Pete, we'll handle this.
Can we get
Dismiss
some
the
of that?
committee.
Yeah, we can dismiss everyone.
Well, maybe you'll knock each other's out.
In your first slide where you mentioned the rates are determined by social, political, and community factors, that always kind of scares me. I go back and make sure my wallet's still here because it says that the rates have to increase. The rates are going to increase. That's just the way that it is. Get used to it. Get over it. In industry, private industry, it doesn't work that way. Everybody in the world is out to cut costs. I mean,
Sure.
that's the number one thing. So my question is, initially, what steps are being made to cut the cost to not to raise the rates? And
Well, sure. Let's talk about that for a minute. In the first place, can you think of a single commodity that costs the same today as it did 20 years ago?
yeah, I can think of a lot of them. And actually, they cost less.
Well,
They
I mean,
get sold for less.
no, remember, we're talking about commodities here. There are certain products where technological advances can reduce costs, things like computers. Sure. There are other basic commodities like a gallon of milk, a hamburger at McDonald's, a gallon of gasoline. All of those cost substantially more than they did. Costs go up. I mean, that's a fact of life. And so water utilities are simply not invulnerable to that. Does that mean a utility should not try to cut costs? Of course not. A well-managed utility is always going to be very cognizant about trying to spend the ratepayers' money in the most prudent way and efficient way possible. But all the cost cutting in the world is not going to result in the repeal of the laws of economics. And the laws of economics is that costs generally go up.
Costs generally go up, and typically there's something associated with that then. Whether it's administrative, material itself, or mining it, or whatever it may be. So have we Paretoed out what our driving factors are that's going to raise the cost?
I think in that, and that was part of the purpose of this presentation, when you get to the bottom line and the considerations and you're looking at the costs and you're looking at the revenues, the real drivers that are very big costs, and these are done by people outside of this organization, but they are in the category of capital, the debt service, and that stuff's expensive. Okay?
And the debt service just scares me to death. Why aren't we reserving for that? Why aren't we wise enough? And I know we are, but I mean, why aren't we considering, listen, I'm looking at my capital equipment. It's 100 years old. I know I'm going to have to replace it. It has a useful life of so many years, X amount of years. I'm going to set aside so much each year so that when that happens, I'm there. That's
Okay. Again, and that was part of Dan's discussion in the utility environment. First of all, when you are talking a plant, okay, you are talking a very expensive place, okay? And also with changing regulations and the requirements on that plant, those costs are very high. And keeping them moving forward is an important part of the capital cost. We have capital needs for two things. We have capital needs for growth. We have capital needs just to maintain the infrastructure. Most of the discussion that Dan talked about is just to maintain the infrastructure. But there is that growth element that has to take place as we are modifying our system.
and where do we get those funds from?
And those funds have to come from a combination of the rates as well as what are called development impact fees. The problem with development impact fees, very simply, is if you build a house, you pay your development impact fee at the time your building permit is issued. And are you okay with waiting 10 to 15 years for all of the other people that are needed to build that water plant before you have water? Of course not. You've got to have it up front. So while we can make assumptions of future building permits, no one knows for sure how many of those are going to be. So some of the system that's been here over time has been developed as we've been going over time. And that becomes an important variable of these costs. You're going to see next week with our engineers, you're going to see some very large costs of things that are needed within the system. And, yeah, go ahead.
Let me just add to that. You're probably going to say the same question. Is that with the current needs right now?
That's the current needs within the system, needs over the next 5 years.
5 years.
And that's next month, not next
Yeah,
week.
I'm sorry.
That's
They
okay.
they
Next
run
month.
together.
He wants us here next week.
Yeah. No, that wasn't any hint. Yes, that's definitely next month.
So I guess we have that huge debt that's just kind of hanging over our heads. And to me, that just seems like we probably missed the boat. And how do we get back on it? Because isn't that a driving factor in what our rates are?
Yeah, absolutely it is. And debt, it's understandable that no utility, no city wants to have a significant amount of debt. Obviously not. But there are a couple of very important things to keep in mind. First thing is the value of the utility system is literally hundreds of millions of dollars. And so when you spend $40 to $50 million to build a treatment plant or overhaul a treatment plant, the only real feasible way of getting the revenue is from debt. Also, this is a very important rate-making reason why debt is not necessarily that bad a thing when it comes to water utilities. And that is, when you build a water treatment plant, you are building an asset that is going to be in place for the next 50 to 75 years. Let's say you wrote a check and paid for it all up front. What that means is that anybody who moves into Goodyear in 2016, 2020, or 2025 gets a free water treatment plant because they haven't paid anything for it. So one reason why debt is not necessarily that bad a thing is that if you issue debt to pay for a new water treatment plant and it's paid off over 30 years, you're making future ratepayers pay the costs that is incurred in that asset which they're using.
Yeah, I understand, and obviously you don't subscribe to Dave Ramsey's philosophy about not having debt. But I'm not a finance guy, so, I look at this as how would I run my house, right?
Right.
And if I'm smart, I'm going to have an emergency fund that's going to cover whatever happens, hopefully whatever happens. The roof blows off, or car runs into the house, or whatever, right? But I'm going to have a constant budget, more or less. Why can't we do something like that? I mean, it seems like all of a sudden we're going to jump into a debt. We're going to have we got this huge debt out there, and I know what you're saying. Believe me, I understand it. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. It just seems like we have these rates. It doesn't seem like we're being proactive enough to make any changes in there to reduce any of the costs. I see all of the costs go up every month, and there may be a good reason, but if we Paretoed out each one of those individual ones, we might be able to do something on that. Have we drilled down significantly enough to take out the costs that we could, and have we done enough planning that we can reserve enough funds so that we can mitigate some of that debt and also keep our rates in check? I guess that's kind of my question.
I would just offer the following thoughts. I think Goodyear has a very capable staff, and I know that the budgets that have been developed are a result of, ultimately put together by the staff and adopted by the council. I'm not an operator, but I don't see a lot of fat in the budget. I just don't, based on what I see for other utilities. Secondly, we are assuming the funding of a repair and replacement reserve, but that's a couple of $1 million a year, but I just don't think it's going to be enough to fund all the capital needs that are going to be necessary. When you're talking about a system that's hundreds of millions of dollars, to put enough in a repair and replacement reserve each year to forestall the need for any new debt, I just think that you'd end up having to really jack your rates up just to pay the repair and replacement reserve. So there's a balancing act. It's a balancing act between your impact fees, your repair and replacement reserve, and your long-term debt. All three of them contribute to the long-term funding of the system.
Other questions? Vice Chairman Banner.
On one of your slides, you had mentioned that 30 to 40% of other cities don't cover their costs through their enterprise fund,
right?
That they're supplemented through the general fund.
Right.
What is the current status of Goodyear's enterprise fund versus Goodyear's general fund contribution, or not?
The city or the enterprise fund is self-sufficient. When he talked about the transfers, that's the cost recovery part that is made back
so
to the
it is
general
feeding
fund,
some money back into the city currently.
which is to pay for the
Services,
overhead.
sure.
Yes.
Does that also include a contingency fund currently? I know a lot of cities have a contingency fund in case of emergencies, in case we lose a large piece of equipment. So in other words, if we're making enough money with water and wastewater to fund water and wastewater, and we're paying the city back general fund for services rendered, do we have money left over, and are we looking at holding any for a contingency fund for emergency repairs?
Again,
main breaks?
as part of the rate structure, there is a reserve component that allows for it because you always have unanticipated cost potentials in operating these types of systems.
So we do have that currently.
We have that, at the existing, and I think early on in these meetings, I did a very high-level financial presentation. The water system does not have a lot of cash reserves compared to where I think it should be. The sewer system at this point in time is very good with its cash reserves.
Thank you.
Yes, committee member Zednik, alternate Zednik.
I was a little surprised on page 10. The capital outlays for the wastewater is, wow. I mean, I must have missed something. After touring the plant and that, I thought the wastewater capital outlays would far exceed the
Slide 19.
regular water capital outlays. What am I missing?
I think that discussion, just because these numbers are going to change, and next month's, excuse me, I almost did it again. Next month's discussion will get into some very specific costs on that.
Right.
But some of the differences that you have between the wastewater and the water is we have programmed a very large expansion of our plant coming up that is not reflected on these schedules because of the other cash that's been set aside for it. That I believe in about 2017, and if I remember right, you're talking somewhere about $9-10 million. That doesn't appear here at all.
Questions? Yes. Committee Member Hinman.
Thank you. Question on slide 34, page 17, on your monthly consumption per account.
I'll get there. Almost there. All right.
Alrighty. For multifamily, you have it broken out, and you allude to an average multifamily community consumes about 90,000 gallons.
Right.
Do you have a sense, because obviously that's all of the individual apartment units combined into one account. Do you have a sense on what the average consumption is per unit, per individual apartment unit?
Not specifically for Goodyear, but typically in industry standards, it's about 3,000 to 4,000 gallons a month. It's very low for an apartment.
So roughly in Goodyear's case, probably about half of what a single family customer.
And when you think about it, it makes logical sense because A, an apartment is typically smaller than a house. B, you typically have fewer people living in an apartment than you do in a house. And C, the apartment community tends to be a little more transient than the homeowner community. So there are going to be certain units that have no occupants in it at all and aren't using any water. So generally, water usage in an apartment is considered to be 50 to 60% of that of a single-family home.
And then for the purposes of Goodyear's rates, a multifamily customer would be considered a commercial customer, correct? A non-residential customer?
That's a very interesting question because that's been an argument that has been taken place in the industry. Many multifamily multifamily apartment house owners will argue that they should pay a residential rate because we're residences. Yes, they are, but they're also businesses. I mean, an apartment house is a business. So what some cities have done is they've created a separate multifamily rate that is neither a commercial rate nor a residential rate. It's a separate multifamily rate, and that is an option for you all to consider. Right now, multifamilies are being charged under the commercial rate.
Okay, and I point that out because under that,
They are,
Yes.
right?
Yes, that's accurate.
I just thought about it.
then under that assessment, if you look at the rate structures and the way, if a
38 and
multifamily
39 are the tables.
Mm-hmm.
38 on the
That's the rate structures, 38.
correct, yeah, the rate
residential
exactly.
and-
So, and if the way Goodyear categorizes multifamily as non-residential, and we're considered, or if the average consumption, if we don't break out an individual unit, then we then fall into a pretty high rate bracket. If you look at, say, a single family, if you consider a single family home, in general, they typically pay $2.36 per 1,000 gallons based on the average consumption. And then for the non-residential, that would put a multifamily customer in the $4.80 range.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So almost paying double the amount
Right.
as a single family customer.
Mm-hmm.
So is there an explanation, or perhaps I'm hearing
Yes.
perhaps the conversation will shift towards how do we rectify that, or how do we
Yes.
bring a little more equity to that?
Yeah, and that's another interesting point you bring up. Typically, when you see residential rates, you will typically see a residential rate per 1,000 gallon lower than a commercial rate. And the reason is that a residential customer, particularly here in the city of Goodyear, pays a availability charge of $11.24. Okay? They then pay a residential rate. They then pay a volumetric rate of $1.30. So let's say a residential customer uses 6,000 gallons a month. Okay? What that means is that residential customer will pay 1.3 times 6 plus 11.24. Pay $19.04 for 6,000 gallons, which is an effective rate of $3.17 a gallon. Now, a multifamily customer pays the same base charge. Let's say a multifamily customer has a unit,
2-inch meter.
2-inch meter, $40, but then they pay $3.30. So their effective rate is going to be a lot closer to this $3.17. see, the reason why this rate can be so low is that they're already paying $11.24 before they use a gallon of water. So they're paying a very high effective rate. So you have to look at what they're paying in total, not just what the volumetric rate is.
Right, but just to use the averages based on the consumption in the city of Goodyear, we're still in a much higher bracket. And I think once you do the math based on the averages, I mean, multifamily customers are paying significantly more. And perhaps we need to, I don't want to take up the entire committee discussion on this topic, but we can probably pose different mathematical situations to show the point.
Okay.
Thank you.
What's your average?
Okay, a commercial customer, a multifamily who uses 40,000 gallons a month pays an effective rate of $4.31, and the residential customer pays the effective rate of $3.17. So it is a little higher, no question about it. So I mean, it is something.
I mean, I would argue significantly higher, but
yeah, it is something that needs to be, evaluated.
thank you. And just one clarification, you'd mentioned that multifamily, they operate more as a business, but the residents do pay the rates. I mean, it is a pass-through. Residents do pay the cost, so just a clarification.
Well, it depends. Some apartment complexes are sub-metered. Some it's just absorbed into the water, into the monthly rent.
Or I don't want to elaborate on the point, but there is ways to essentially bill back to the residents.
Sure.
It's allowed in statute too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I
formula.
So committee member Hinman would like that considered in your modeling.
Absolutely.
I think.
Thank you.
Okay.
I mean, there is the model, the calculations, without question, have the ability to calculate a separate, just and reasonable multifamily rate, if that is what the committee would like to do.
Okay. Other questions?
Yeah, would you go through that math one more time? I was a little bit foggy because when I look at let's look at slide, what is that, 36. It says for residential, 30,000 and above, the rate is effective rate is 6 1/4, right? 30.
That's correct.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and then a residential household would pay also the 11.24.
Right.
On top of that,
That's
right?
correct.
Okay. Then if you look at the commercial, up to 40,000, so you're still in that same ballpark. The effective rate is 3.30.
Right.
But they'll pay on a 2-inch meter probably, or
Right.
2-inch line, so that's the $40. So
Right.
you're saying that those two are effectively a wash, I guess.
No.
I know you were calculating some stuff there, and I missed it.
I was calculating based on the average usage in a month.
Okay.
Now, if you talk about a high volume user, particularly a residential high volume user, this has to be considered to be a penalty rate here.
Oh, okay.
$6.25.
Okay.
You don't want a residential customer using that much water.
Well, no, you don't, but that was the only way that I couldn't compare a non-residential because you didn't go down. You don't go low enough on that. So I was trying to do an apple-and-apple comparison.
Effective rates are going to vary based on the total amount of usage. Just as the quick back of the envelope calculation, I was using average usage for a residential and a multifamily rate.
Okay.
Committee members and Monarch, I'm sorry, you had a question.
Just a general question first. Page 9, it was the City of Goodyear forecast operating costs. This was question number 1. Number 5150 was water resource.
I'm sorry.
What
page
slide
are we
is it? If you know the slide, that's helpful.
17?
Okay, thank you.
More of a principal question.
Okay. There we go. Operating costs?
Yes.
Okay.
Water resource. Is the definition of that paying for the water?
I'm sorry?
Definition of that just paying for the water.
Water resource?
The reason I ask that, and it's a principal question. Up until this rate conversation, I heard, and one of the concerns is sustainability.
Mhm.
So is that the price of the water that we're buying, the city's buying? What is the water resource definition?
Mark Holmes can probably answer that question.
That's the account
I
5150.
understand distribution, I understand production, water quality, water resource. I don't know what that definition is.
That is a combination of several different components within the water resources budget. Various components. It is not paying for the water resources, the wet water supplies. It is an account that's paying primarily, I will say, administration. I don't have the account breakdown in front of me tonight, but it's the account that's strictly for my division within Public Works. So it's various components, a breakdown in water resources. For example, if you look at the very top, the CAP water costs, the $3.6 million in 2015 out to $4.5 in 2019, that's the actual commodity costs for the CAP water supplies year after year after year. So we're actually ordering the CAP water every year. That's the total commodity cost if we order all the CAP water.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Sort of.
Right.
You want to answer? I just want to clarify a little bit in this as far as that CAP water cost. And I want to remind you of what Dan talked about up front. But at tonight's discussion, don't focus on the specific numbers as much as what's included in there, and it is a good question. So the water resource would be dealing with the compliance areas of getting legal rights to the water and so forth. The CAP water costs would be dealing with actually literally the cost of the water rights themselves, which are not expensive, and then the others are the various operating costs.
That is exactly
of the
where
system.
my question was. It's exactly, and I don't want to get into the details. It's exactly the point. Because everything else is just talking about plain old inflation. That was his comment, plain old inflation. And yet we've heard for several months there that we need to be concerned about sustainability. There's finite resources. This does not seem like this would be a linear function. This seems like it should be exponential. And I think the mathematics underlying this first line are wrong, therefore, given what I've heard for the first 3 months I was on the committee. That's all. And I don't have an argument about it, but that's what it seems to me right now.
Okay, and I think that is a very fair discussion that we will be involved with. Absolutely. In fact, that's one of the most critical discussions that we're going to have in this whole structure is what is that right level for those water resource needs as we're looking in the next 5 years.
Thank you. And he was just talking about rates, so I understood that.
Yeah.
Okay. Good night.
Other questions?
The other thing is, I still would like some detail about depreciation. I asked that a couple months ago, but I understand depreciation, I understand finance, I understand the economics. I'd like the details. So it wouldn't bore me if I got provided that. Okay? What is behind the depreciation and those assumptions? Not tonight.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. Committee Member Sharp.
This is slide 28. Okay. Rate revenues. Okay. In your experience, Dan, you've said connection fees, it includes but not limited to those. In your experience working with other cities, what are other non-rate revenues that perhaps we do not have that other cities do?
My recollection in looking at your non-rate revenue schedule is that it's a pretty standard one. You know, one of the big components is, for example, is late payment charges. That generates revenue, but that is meant not only to generate revenue, but it's also meant to be a disincentive. You know, to get people to pay their bills on time. It's a fine line. Sometimes cities have to run in terms of how much, what services are included in basic water service and what are extra. You know, I fly a lot, and I've noticed one thing about the airline industry is everything is extra now. Even getting a bag of peanuts on a plane now you have to pay for, whereas that didn't used to be the case. And I think water utilities have to kind of balance that a little bit. One example being, for example, meter tests. Many cities have the policy that if you run a meter, customer has to do a meter test because they think their meter is improper. If they run the meter test and it turns out the customer is right, he doesn't have to pay for the meter test because the customer is correct. And so I think that you have to balance non-rate fees, not only with not giving the impression that you're nickel and diming your customer, but at the same time, there are definitely services that are for specific customers that those customers should have to pay for that should not be included in water and wastewater rates, because every time a service like this is asked for, the city incurs a cost. So the question becomes, who pays it? The person asking for the service or everybody else? So, but to get back to your main question, your set of non-rate fees is a very standard one for a city the size of Goodyear, and I don't recall off the top of my head there being any services that I would include that are not already being included in your chart of accounts for those services.
Any other questions? Oh, do you have a follow-on, Committee Member Shack?
Where would you put people who want to build swimming pools?
People who want to build what?
People who
Swimming
want
pools.
swimming pools as a non-rate revenue.
How do you mean? I mean, how would that?
Does Goodyear benefit at all from anybody who comes and says, we want to install a swimming pool in the city? Is there a fee for that?
As far as in the water structure, there isn't a special fee for swimming pools, but the water that goes into the pool obviously gets charged, and because of the rate structure, it gets charged at the higher rate.
Right.
Yeah,
I understand that. I meant in
block.
addition to the
Right.
amount of gallons used.
And don't fill a pool in January, February, or March.
Yes, I learned that when I had a breakdown in mine. It wasn't pretty. But outside of that, I don't think I'm not aware of any program that specifically addresses swimming pools as far as non-utility rate. There would, of course, be permits and so forth required, but they would be for other types of structures.
Yes, I'm sorry. Chairman Columbia.
Let me try this here just for a moment. Let's talk a little bit about the future debt. So your definitions, long-term debt forecasted. That's the word you use, is forecasted.
Right.
Then I take a look, and it says here we've got forecasted out $300,000 for 2016 all the way through 2019 at $4 million and some change.
Right.
So something along what the bill was talking about. So that is a fund that we're saying we may spend that type of money during those times, correct?
These numbers are going to significantly change as a result of the master plan. There will be additional debt, but the question now is going to become what projects have been identified by the engineer as being critical.
But I think somebody's already identified because you've got it out through 2019.
Right.
So we've already identified capital. We've said this is what we're going to do through 2019.
Right. We did some preliminary, we and city staff sat down and did some very preliminary estimates about what capital improvements were going to be needed.
All right, so with that said, then was there a note or anything out there that was going to cover this $4 million? Not $4 million, but out through 2019, there's $4 million. So
Okay, and that's where, as we're talking next week, or next month,
I jumped the gun.
I keep
You want
trying
us
to
here
move
next
this
week.
ahead. As we're talking next month, and the engineers are presenting the 5-year portion of the Integrated Water Master Plan, as well as some asset management, that's where several of these items, the capital cost that Dan referred to, as well as that's part of where we say these numbers will be subject to change, but this conversation also will be relevant at that point in time, and you'll have an opportunity to ask the engineers, how necessary is this, the types of questions that you would. So those numbers today are just placeholders.
That was it right there. So it's just a placeholder. It's not a fund that's sitting out there. We don't have this money sitting
Oh, right.
out there where we can go use it. We're just
Exactly.
guessing.
Right.
Somewhere in time, somebody guessed.
Right.
Nobody created a note or a pull out of a general fund. Nothing.
Right.
Nothing has
Just a
even
number.
started to have the conversation that we would have to do that. Nothing has started.
Other
I
questions?
see.
Yeah.
In the
Come in,
finance industry, we don't guess, we do educated estimates.
Easy now.
But the key though is that one of the advantages of running a water and wastewater utility is that you generally know years in advance that these major capital improvements are going to be necessary. How much, you don't really know, but you generally have a good ballpark estimate. So that enables you to design a long-term rate plan that gradually starts phasing in rates so that when you do issue the debt, your rates are already in place that will enable you to fund the debt service without a big shock to your ratepayers. And that's what we were trying to
Right, those are placeholders, and so at the next meeting,
okay.
and when they have the integrated water master plan, you will see that and be able to comment on that and have additional considerations.
Great. Look forward to talking to those engineers.
Other questions? Committee members, Ednick.
Yeah, I just clarification. What is a residential county? What is that?
Those are residential customers that are outside the city limits of Goodyear.
Why are we giving them water?
Because it's typical for cities. If you have a customer who's like right next to the city or right very close to the city but outside the city limits, it's not uncommon for a city to provide that service to a limited number of customers. And it just sort of depends on the geography and.
Well, why couldn't we get the water supplier north of I-10 to supply us with water? We're real close to them.
Their certificate, I can't even tell you where those 88 customers are. I don't know. I'd have to ask our meter readers and that where they are. But they would not be in the certificated area that the other suppliers would have. So this would be the only source they have. I am not aware in the 10 years I've been here of us adding any developments. I won't say we didn't add a house, but I'm not aware of us adding any development. We don't, as a matter of practice, bring in like subdivisions that aren't in the city into our water and sewer systems. And that's why you see the number count so low.
Yeah, it is low.
It's just happened over time.
Yeah, it was like 88 or something.
Exactly.
On slide number, let me look here. Looks like 38. We talk about the current and adopted water rate plan. Is this like my income tax where if I go from 0 to 6,000 gallons, I pay 15%, and then anything over from 6,000 to 12,000, I'm in the 28%,
Exactly
25%?
right.
Okay. So it's not like if I use 12,000 gallons, or if I use, let's say, 8,000 gallons, that I fall into that $2.59. The
Right.
first 6,000 is at one rate, and then any additional.
Exactly right.
So it's like my income tax. All right.
Exactly right.
Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Okay. Well, I've written down a couple things that I thought you had might want them to consider. The cost-cutting measures, I wrote down reserving for debt service, the multifamily consideration, giving more equity to that, details about depreciation, and considering people who want to build swimming pools is what I had written down from your discussion so far.
And the debt.
Debt. Yes, I did. Reserving for debt service. Yes, sir. Vice Chair Battern.
Under the considerations also,
Yes?
with the rate increases, if, I'm not in this, but I know some people that are, that have a fixed income, if there's some way that we can look at, not everybody special, but if they meet criteria and they're under a fixed income, if they could hold their rates, if, we can balance that across, if it's feasible to do, but something that allows them, when you got fixed income, obviously, and things are going up, you don't have more money to cover it. So is there some way that we can look after our residents? And I'm sorry, go ahead, Ms. Pancras.
I'm sorry, but they do have that for taxes.
Right. So do we have that for water? Is that something we could also look into?
I've written that down.
Thank you.
For something to consider.
It's what's called a lifeline rate. Some cities do it. If you meet a certain criteria, then you are given a lower rate as a result. couple of things to keep in mind, though, about lifeline rates. One, you have to be very definitive about the criteria you use because it invites people,
To take advantage of the system, sure.
And secondly, if you charge less to one person, you got to charge more to another.
No.
And that's the difficulty in that, anybody who gets a break, the break has to be paid for by somebody. And that's
trying.
Once again,
Right, but
another policy decision.
I think it's important to take care of our citizens as much as the money aspect too.
Yes.
So I'd be willing to pay a little more if I needed to. I'll put it that way.
Okay, we'll have that. Any others or questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to pass the meeting back to the chairman.
I thought of a commodity that went down. Gold.
Okay, I think we've covered everything here. Of course, this is time where if you want to talk about anything else other than what we've discussed, I think we've covered everything.
No, Mr. Chairman, we haven't. Beginning the first presentation, the idea of forming subcommittees was met with disapproval by staff. I continue to think, as I told you privately last time, that the idea of a subcommittee might have some benefit. A lot of people who really can't speak enough because of the number of people in the committee, and I think inclined at the next meeting to move for the agenda to be amended for the committee to discuss the feasibility about having subcommittees. And the reason I'm saying that now is so people can think about it over the next course of a few weeks. So when I raise the motion, if they don't want the discussion, it'll be defeated. But I'm not sold on the idea myself, but I think it's worth thinking about.
Let's also not forget about, we mentioned maybe 2 times a month. It's a possibility as well. So we can definitely bring that up at the next meeting, next discussion. We'll bring it up on the minutes.
And if there's something specific that we'd like presented or have discussion time for, that is certainly available for you to put on the agenda if there's a specific topic. Is that right, Anna?
Okay.
I have a
Go
question.
ahead. Go ahead, Peter.
We're an open forum type of situation,
forum.
right? We discussed a little bit last week, and or last month. Yeah, I'm on the
Everybody's
same.
back on that
I'm
week
on the
schedule.
same calendar you are. Last month about the reclaimed water and where does it all go and things like that. I know that the not the Corrigan Wash, but the Bullard Reclamation Center goes to recharge the aquifers, and that makes a lot of sense. And I think it was Rainbow Valley that is used to water the golf course in Estrella, and also the Corrigan Wash. Some or all of that water goes into the lakes for irrigation in Estrella. What other? And first of all, are we charging for that reclaimed water? And I think the answer was no. What other? Who gets the free water? And why are we giving it away? I guess is kind of the blunt question.
I honestly don't remember anybody saying we were giving it away for free, but
Bill
I
said
could
it.
be wrong.
Bill said it.
No, I said it.
Bill said it.
You said we're giving it away
I
for
said
free.
we're giving it away.
Okay.
I don't know. Mark?
Actually, he said it was stupid.
So
I
is
did
that
say it
something
was
you'd like
stupid.
considered in the?
I think we need we can consider that.
Yeah,
Put
and-
that down as a question. Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll
I
look
think-
into that because I don't remember that other than you saying.
Well, I asked the
Yeah,
question,
right.
and I believe that the other Mark with the tie on, said, yeah, 2 out of the 3 reclamation centers we're not charging for water. Yes,
We
ma'am.
did it at one time. We did give water to Palo Verde Nuclear Power.
Yeah, and we cut that out.
And now we do recharge. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now we recharge that water back into the ground out there on.
Well,
Bill and
I
both
guess
thought
I
we were
don't.
talking to each other. We thought we heard that there was free water being given to some community up by the mountains.
Mhm.
That's what we
Estrella
thought we heard.
Yeah.
That's what we thought we heard. That's why he asked the question.
Well,
Yeah.
let's just put it down as a question.
It's a
and
question, yeah.
We'll visit that.
Yeah.
Have it written down.
And
And I approached Estrella Mountain, and I've gotten called. I mean, I'm on my 3rd person yet, so
Oh.
I haven't.
only 3?
I'm on my third person to find out what that fee is on the over and above the water bill for Estrella Mountain, but
Yeah.
I haven't.
Yeah, I guess, because I think the recharged water is a big factor in our rates and in our future rates, certainly. So if we're giving away or charging, not charging, or however you want to call it,
Free.
two out of the three reclamation centers, then that's kind of, I think I said dumb, didn't I?
Stupid, I thought was the word.
Oh, stupid. Oh, okay.
Yes, I remember.
Well,
I wrote it down.
It could be.
So
Oh, okay.
I do have that written down, though,
right,
for
that's fine.
the next as
Thank you.
question and consideration.
Anyone else?
I have another point. I thought
Go ahead.
the woman who spoke from the community had an interesting point. And I don't want the committee to forget about it, and I don't know how valuable the statement or accurate it is. But if there are development that abuse is a strong word, and I don't know what's going on, but it's something that I don't want the committee to put off the table.
So one of your options, Chairman, is to have staff look into that. One of your options.
That's what we'll have to do then.
Yes, we'll have to do that, Mr. Chair.
Is that what the committee would like?
That's the committee would like to do.
Yes.
Yes,
will-
staff look into that.
We will do that.
Anything else? I'll look this way and then that way.
I'm glad we're sitting across from each other.
That's why they.
Talking to me this morning with that phone call. Yeah, I need a drink.
Okay. So I think the next meeting will be held on Tuesday, March 10th at 6:30 p.m. There will be no further business to discuss. This meeting is adjourned.